I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, we have now moved on to the next stage of this Sewing Skills for Beginners course, which I'm providing for free as a Learn to Sew YouTube series. I'm really excited that you're here and you've stuck with me for this long. I hope you found it helpful and informative, and if you know anyone that would want to learn to sew, then do share these videos with them. I am Eve Tokens, the creative curator. Let's rock on. In today's lesson, you are going to be learning about the different types of seams. Yeah, I've got different seams and their uses written down. So this will be a relatively short video. I'm just going to walk you through the different types of seams and when you would use them. And then each day there'll be a new video lesson teaching you the process of each of those seams. So upcoming, we have the plain seam, the welt seam, the lapped seam, the French seam, the flat felled seam, the mock French seam, the piped seam, and I'm pretty sure there's some others as well that I haven't added in yet. So those will be coming up over the next few days, but for now, let's go and have a look at the different types of seams and their use, so that you have an understanding of what the different seams look like before we actually move on to how to sew each of the seams. Now, the only one I don't have is the plain seam, because I used the sample for something else. It became the stitch and the dip sample. So unfortunately you can't see that, but I'm sure you've seen a plain seam before. It is literally two pieces of fabric placed together, right sides together, stitched down one edge, and then that seam is either left as is, which is the plain seam, or it is pressed open and it becomes the open seam. So that's your basic standard one. All of these seams I'm going to link to you in the description, because I have articles on my website showing the process. Each day going forward there will be a new sewing seam tutorial which will drop as well, so that you can go through them as and when you need them and refer back to them, and they're actually quite short. So the next one I want to talk to you about is the welt seam. Welt seam, as you can see, I've sewn it on denim. It is a seam that you will often find on denim wear, workwear and outerwear. The reason being is that it is finished on the inside, so this is the wrong side, with a zigzag stitch, and then it is top stitched in place. Can you see that? So it's not an enclosed seam, but it is a strong seam. As you can see, it's holding firm because it's been reinforced with, you know, extra layers of stitching. So that's the welt seam. It's one of my favorite and easy. It's one of my favorite seams, and it's super easy to sew. Then we have the enclosed seams. Yeah, we have the enclosed seams. So the French seam is probably the most obvious, and you would use a French seam on finer fabrics like chiffons and thinner silks, or maybe like a cotton lawn, which is quite a lightweight cotton. I've used it here. This is a French seam sample. If I show you the reverse, you can see it's a very simple, very beautiful finished seam. You wouldn't use a French seam on a heavyweight fabric like a wool boucle or denim, because those fabrics are too heavy. A French seam is really good for like sheer fabrics, just to finish it nicely and keep all the raw edges tucked away. So that's a French seam. But there's also such a thing as a mock French seam, and I've done a second sample here. And I've done it in the separate fabric, different printed fabrics, so you can see the difference. But you can see with this one, can you see there is, as well as the original stitch line here, there's a second stitch line, and that's what makes it a mock French seam. On the original, you can see that there isn't that extra line of stitching. It just is. So that's the French seam and the mock French seam. The final enclosed seam is a felled seam, as you can see here. These you would see on shirts, mostly men's shirts, around all the inside seams really would be felled. It's sometimes called a run and fell seam, and you can see that it's completely enclosed. Okay, so this is a really simple one to do. It uses a larger seam allowance than most other seams, purely because you do need to cut some of it away in order to wrap it and fell it. It's one of my favourite seam types as well. I think they're all my favourite seam types, really. Then we move on to the lapped seam. So I only really use a lapped seam when I am working with leather and other materials that don't really have, that are not woven or knitted, really. So I've done a little sample here on some leather remnants that I have, and you can see that it's just lapped over, one on top of the other, and then stitched in place. Super simple. If you're using a leather, obviously you would want to use a leather foot. which I did, but you'll see that in the relevant lesson, and that's a lapped seam. Bum, bum, bum. And then finally, the last seam I have for you is a piped seam. Can you see that? So that is a piece of piping that I've created. It's a very narrow piece of piping, but I've inserted that in the seam, and so it makes for an interesting design detail. That is something that you would use. I mean, people use it a lot in homeware, but if you're making a garment with lots of seams, maybe like a denim jacket or an interesting dress with different style lines, then actually adding piping to the seam to make it a piped seam is actually an interesting way to add visual interest. There you have it. Those are all the seams that I'm covering here in this Learn to Sew course. I told you it was a quick video. I hope that you find those helpful. The next few days, those tutorials will be dropping so that you can go and learn and practice. Once you've done it once, they're super simple, easy to do. And then after that, I think we're moving on to hems, but I will remind you towards the end of the next tutorials. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.